Harry, thanks a lot for giving me the opportunity to share some of my perspectives on IPD, and prepared a few short slides to talk about what we've seen as a company on some of our projects. And once again, my name is Dave Kelly. I'm Vice President and General Manager at Turner Construction. The title of my presentation is IPD, a Departure from Business as Usual. And the best way to really think about that is to first think about the way that construction projects are traditionally organized and executed. And that's the traditional project method, which has the diagram on the right with the owner and the architect. And Katie had some of this as well. You might have the CM as constructor or general contractor, and then a variety of subcontractors on the right-hand side. But what's key is just to think about a few aspects of this model. Because if we really think about how this model, nudges people to behave, then we can really understand how IPD works in many different ways. But on a traditional model, there's many tugs between the participants. You've got a fairly, robust org chart there, and each entity is tied. The key thing here is profit is generated and retained by each entity. So the architect has their own profit, the construction manager or general contractor has their profit, each subcontractor has their own profit, and it's earned as a result of their ability to complete their work at or below the cost that they've estimated for their own little slice of the project. Communication generally follows the contractual ties. So the owner will coordinate with the architect and the contractor will coordinate with the subcontractors. It's not shown here, but there's a lot of communication between the architect and the contractor, but it generally tends to follow the contract ties. A structure like this, it tends to get people to think about the project as a zero-sum game. So if one participant is not making money or getting disadvantaged, somebody else might be getting advantage. So because the parties are siloed, because they're individually generating their own profit, they can sometimes fall into the trap of thinking of it as a zero-sum game. And we've all probably seen that throughout our careers. Traditional projects are vertically integrated, they're hierarchical. Contractually, risk is pushed downhill. The owner pushes risk down to the architect and to the contractor. Contractor pushes it down to the subcontractors, and so on and so forth. Trust can be low. It's generally low. Everybody tends to follow the contract. Let's make sure everything's in writing. Let's make sure everything is spelled out. Let's make sure our obligations are clear. Let's get everything in writing. Let's make sure the drawings are perfect. If we have a question, we have to ask it in writing. So everything needs to be documented. There's a lot of time and effort expended to get everything in writing and make sure it's proper and appropriate. And also the traditional model generally has everybody officed separately. So the architect will be in their office, the contractor might have some office staff in their office, have a superintendent in the field, subcontractors the same way. So that's what we all tend to experience in one form or another doing traditional projects. When you move to an IPD model, it ends up being a lot different. On an IPD model, there's a single multi-party design and construction agreement that is signed by the owner, the contractor, and the architect. And depending on the form, if it's multi-party or poly-party, and there's all kinds of nuances, the major subcontractors they either sign that agreement as well, or they can be joined to it through amendments that add the different subcontractors. One of the key differences in an IPD is the profit is generated through the overall project success. So each entity takes their profit, puts it into a shared risk pool, and then the entire profit is either earned or partially earned or completely lost, depending on the outcome of the project. Nobody is in a silo. You basically have a single silo. Communication is open, and it's encouraged to be open by the various forms of agreement. Key thing is the pie can expand. They talk about a zero-sum game on the traditional. Efficiencies gained in the construction process and in the design process can leave dollars unspent that then can either go to scope or they can go to bonuses or shared compensation for the whole team. So there really is a way to expand the pie if the project is completed for less than it's estimated for. It's a very flat process. It's non-hierarchical. Risk is managed as a team as opposed to being pushed downhill. Trust must be high. And many of these projects in our experience have co-location, have a big room, something on site, something near the site where you might have architects, engineers, contractors, key trade partners, everybody working in a shared office, kind of a cross-functional team concept. So those two models generally describe the two major shifts between a traditional project and an integrated project. But what are some of our key takeaways from being involved in multiple IPD engagements is the first one is really the importance of behavioral change. And that's really especially, and everybody has to change, the trade partners, the contractor, the architect. But from my perspective, it's especially on the part of the owner, because it's a big change if you're an owner working under, from my perspective, if you're working under a traditional model to switch to an IPD. And I've got some questions that are kind of thought-provoking on the next slide we can talk about. Also, the cultural norms can be a barrier. So if you spend 20 years working into a traditional model, you begin to think a certain way about how the project ought to work and how communication ought to work and how parties ought to behave. And then you switch to an IPD, you have to be able to overcome those cultural norms and those ways of doing things that are not productive under an IPD arrangement. Also trust. Everybody who's in the IPD, and it's not all the partners, but it's generally 60 to 70% of the participants are in the IPD and sharing their profit. They are partners now. Everybody at the table is a partner. And what comes with that is there needs to be a tremendous amount of trust that everyone's working towards the same goals. But many of the IPD projects that we've signed also have a robust audit program to verify what is cost, what's overhead, what's profit, and make sure that all the dollars are kept within the same bucket to keep really in using the audit as a means to build trust among the team members. And I believe that, personally, that the owner takes on more risk when they do an IPD. Others may have a different perspective on this, so I'm not issuing an edict here, but I believe the owner takes on more risk than a traditional model. And the primary thing is it's not a stipulated or a guaranteed price. So, if you're thinking about doing an IPD, I developed a handful of questions here. They're sort of screening questions for a project owner. Are you comfortable hiring the contractor and subcontractors using an uncapped reimbursement model? You have to be somewhat comfortable with that if you're going to do an IPD. Are you prepared to engage nearly full-time in the management of a project as a participating team member? The owner has to be at the table at a lot of the meetings, almost all the meetings, to give their input, to give their insight into what they want and to help make decisions as part of the management team. Do you believe better results are achievable through intense team integration? In my mind, the owner really has to believe that in order to want to do an IPD. As the owner, are you comfortable with the contractor and subcontractors having near equal say in decisions about products, materials, specifications? So really partnering and trusting that everyone's got your interests in mind. And as an owner, are you comfortable paying bonuses and other incentive compensation to the architect, the contractor, and the subcontractors if the key project indicators are achieved? And are you comfortable doing this even after having implemented cost reduction measures? So you may have gone through a cost reduction phase. You may have gone through a right sizing, a benchmarking phase. You may have felt as though you made concessions to allow the project to meet budget. And now there are bonuses being paid out at the end of it. Are you comfortable with that? Do you feel like you really got value out of it? So those are some of the key things. And that in my mind, an owner would have to put a check mark next to each one of those to really get serious about doing an IPD. And then my last slide is, it's just kind of a final thought. I believe IPD requires everyone to think differently. So I appreciate the opportunity to share my perspective. Thank you, Hani.
Thank you, Dave. Appreciate it. Appreciate your presentation, and we'll kind of come back hopefully with questions after Jack presents the owner perspective.